The studio lights were blinding, hot against the skin, their beams bouncing off polished surfaces and the glossy desk at center stage. The murmur of the audience faded into an anticipatory hush, the kind of silence that doesn't come naturally but is forced, held tightly like the breath before a storm breaks. Cameras swiveled on their mechanical necks, their red lights glowing like unblinking eyes, capturing every angle, every tremor. Tonight's broadcast promised tension, but no one in the room could have guessed just how explosive the moment would become. Rachel Maddow sat tall behind her notes, her trademark glasses reflecting a faint glare from the teleprompter. Her calm voice had guided millions of viewers through political chaos for years, weaving facts into narratives that often felt like lifelines in stormy seas. Rachel carried herself like someone who bore the weight of truth, telling as a duty, sometimes even as a burden. Yet beneath her poise lingered the fatigue of endless battles against misinformation, against political gamesmanship, against the gnawing question of whether her words even pierced the noise anymore. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, a rising star in the Democratic Party, her posture straight but her fingers drumming an impatient rhythm against her knee, just out of sight. Jasmine had fought her way here from the courts of Texas, where she'd been a relentless public defender for those who had nowhere else to turn. She carried the memories of her clients with her, the mothers broken by a system stacked against them, the young men swallowed by prisons for crimes of desperation. Those ghosts gave her fire, and sometimes that fire burned too brightly for the comfort of colleagues who preferred politics neat, tidy, and palatable. The show had begun as expected. Rachel's opening monologue dissected the day's news. A congressional hearing turned circus, policy promises clashing with political realities, the old tug-of-war between optimism and cynicism. When she turned to Jasmine, the conversation was supposed to be straightforward analysis, commentary, the usual volley of perspectives that kept cable news humming. But from the moment Jasmine spoke, her voice low, deliberate, the energy shifted. "I'm going to be real with you, Rachel," Jasmine began, her eyes locking onto the camera as though speaking directly to every living room across the country. People are tired, not just tired of the lies, but tired of the polished half-truths. They're tired of politicians who sound like they're auditioning for history books instead of fighting for today. Rachel adjusted her glasses, nodding politely, prepared to steer the conversation back into familiar lanes. But Jasmine wasn't interested in lanes. She leaned forward, her voice gathering power, and then she dropped it. The line that would replay on countless clips within hours. "America doesn't need another narrator of the storm," Jasmine said, her words slicing through the air like glass. "We need someone willing to stand in the rain and get soaked with the people." The studio seemed to stop breathing. Rachel's lips parted slightly, caught between a smile and surprise, her practiced composure shaken. It wasn't an insult, not directly. It was a challenge sharp, undeniable, and laced with the raw frustration of a generation that had grown weary of watching politics as spectacle. Rachel recovered quickly, of course. Years of live television had trained her reflexes. But for the audience, that moment burned itself into memory. Jasmine's unflinching gaze, Rachel's brief flicker of vulnerability, and the undeniable clash of two voices, one representing the authority of establishment commentary, the other embodying the restless urgency of change. Behind that one savage line, though, lay stories deeper than the broadcast revealed. Jasmine's conviction hadn't sprung from nowhere. It had roots in nights she'd spent driving home from court with the faces of clients burned into her thoughts, wondering if justice in America was designed only for the wealthy. It came from phone calls to her mother, where she confessed how exhausting it was to fight battles that felt predetermined. And it came from her fear, the quiet, hidden fear, that even her fire might one day be tamed by the very system she sought to challenge. Rachel, too, carried her own unspoken weight. Off camera, she often sat alone in her office, long after the newsroom emptied, staring at stacks of reports, trying to trace patterns of corruption and greed. Her fear was different from Jasmine's, but just as real, that in telling the stories of America's storms, she had become more chronicler than participant, her role essential but also detached. And though she wouldn't admit it aloud, Rachel sometimes wondered if voices like Jasmine's, bold, unrestrained, unafraid to bleed, were what the future demanded. The interview pressed on. They debated policy, shared stories of ordinary people caught in the crossfire of decisions made in marble halls, sparred gently on strategy. But the current had shifted. Every exchange now carried an undercurrent of that earlier line, as though Jasmine's challenge lingered in the room, shaping every word spoken after it. Meanwhile, beyond the studio, the world spun with its own dramas. In Texas, a mother named Gloria watched the broadcast while folding laundry. Her son, Marcus, had been arrested 2 weeks earlier for a petty theft, stealing food from a convenience store, and was facing charges that could ruin his future. When she heard Jasmine's words, she felt, for the first time in weeks, that someone understood the weight pressing down on her chest. Across the country in Michigan, a group of young activists huddled in a basement with protest signs leaning against the walls. They had been planning a march for climate justice, discouraged by the lack of media attention. But when Jasmine's clip went viral, they replayed it again and again, her fire rekindling their own. If she could stand on national television and cut through the noise, maybe their voices could pierce the silence too. Back in the studio, the tension softened into unexpected warmth. As the cameras prepared to cut to commercial, Rachel leaned slightly toward Jasmine and whispered, just off mic, that was one hell of a line. Jasmine smiled, not smugly, but with the quiet relief of someone who had spoken her truth and been heard. The aftermath unfolded like ripples in a pond. Social media erupted, some praising Jasmine as fearless, others accusing her of disrespect. Headlines blared about the clash, dissecting motives, exaggerating drama. But beneath the noise, something more meaningful stirred. Conversations in kitchens, in classrooms, in community halls, about what it meant to lead, to speak, to truly stand with the people rather than above them. In the weeks that followed, Rachel invited Jasmine back for another discussion, this time not as a commentator, but as a co-narrator of sorts. They sat side by side, exploring stories from the ground, the kind that too often slipped through the cracks of mainstream coverage. Their dynamic evolved, not adversarial but complementary, Rachel's depth of context meeting Jasmine's raw urgency. Both women grew from that moment. Jasmine learned that her fire didn't have to burn bridges. It could light torches for others to carry. Rachel discovered that narrating the storm didn't mean she couldn't step outside, feel the rain, and sometimes even march with those in the streets she once only described. The lesson that lingered was not about victory or defeat, not about who stunned whom, but about the power of honesty when spoken with courage. One savage line had cut through the noise, but it was the dialogue that followed, the willingness to stay in the discomfort of truth, that carried lasting weight. And for those who watched that night, whether from a laundry room in Texas or a crowded basement in Michigan, the message was clear. Change doesn't begin in headlines or broadcasts. It begins in the willingness to speak, to listen, and to risk getting soaked together in the rain.